Here's a number that stops most people cold. A single new pair of speakers, hand-built today in a small factory in Arkansas, will run you close to $18,000. Not the full system, not the amp, not the turntable, just the two boxes. And the design they're based on is almost 80 years old. That's not a typo, and it's not marketing. That's the going rate on one of the 5 speakers I'm about to walk you through tonight. Gear that was built in an era when companies weren't trying to fit a speaker into your apartment, they were trying to win the showroom floor. And if your living room couldn't handle it, that was your problem, not theirs. I'm Gary Simmons. I've been on the bench fixing this stuff professionally, and for my own bad habit of collecting it, for about 40 years now. If you're new here, I look at vintage receivers, amplifiers, and speaker cabinets the way a mechanic looks at an old car. I open them up, I test them on the scope, and I tell you honestly what you're getting into before you spend real money. If that sounds useful to you, there's a subscribe button down there, and I'd be glad to have you along. Tonight, it's 5 speakers, all from the 1970s, all of them in their own way, completely out of their minds. Let's get into it. Number 5, Pioneer HPM-100. We're starting with the one I'd actually point a beginner toward because it's the most honest entry point into this whole hobby. The Pioneer HPM-100 hit the market in the mid-1970s, and on paper, it's a 4-way, 4-driver bass reflex design built around a 12-inch woofer with a carbon fiber blend cone. Each cabinet runs somewhere around 55 to 60 pounds with a front baffle that's a genuinely thick 50 millimeters of wood. Pioneer wasn't skimping on the box, even if some of the internals cut corners we'll get to in a second. Here's the story behind it, and it's a real one. The HPM series was designed by a man named Bart Lecomte, who spent the 1960s as JBL's vice president of engineering. He's the same engineer credited with developing the JBL 100 Century, which was the best-selling home speaker of the decade. Lecomte left JBL, Pioneer brought him on in the mid-1970s as a VP of their own, and gave him the mandate to go build something that would go head-to-head with the speaker he'd already made famous. That's not internet legend. That's documented in his own engineering history. The HPM-100 was his answer. Now, on the bench, here's what I actually see when these come in. The woofer surround on the HPM-100 isn't your typical open-cell foam. It's a textile surround impregnated with a viscous damping compound. That compound is the part nobody tells you about. Over 40-plus years, it hardens. When it hardens, it either restricts the woofer's excursion, which chokes your bass, or it cracks outright, which is a full surround failure either way. If a seller shows you a mint pair and never mentions the surrounds, assume they haven't looked closely and budget for a refoam or re-surround job. It's not expensive work, and the woofer itself, aluminum die-cast frame, big magnet structure, usually comes through fine underneath. The other thing techs argue about constantly is the crossover. A lot of us who've had these open on the bench feel the crossover points were set higher than they should have been from the factory, which can push some brightness into the upper mid-range over long listening sessions. Some owners recap and rework the network. I'm not going to tell you to start modifying a 45-year-old speaker unless you actually know your way around a soldering iron and a multimeter, but I will tell you the community around these is large, the parts are available, and if you want to learn crossover work, this is a forgiving speaker to learn on. Buying advice. A good pair today typically runs $700 to $900, sometimes less if you're patient and local. Confirm you're getting a genuine matched pair. There were different wattage variants of this driver's set over the production run, and a mismatched pair will never image correctly no matter how good each individual box sounds. A couple more things worth knowing before you commit to a pair. The wood veneer on these cabinets is thin, thinner than a lot of people expect once they see it up close. So if you're planning to refinish rather than just clean them up, go slowly with the sanding or you'll cut straight through it. And check the piezoelectric super tweeter while you're at it. Piezo elements either work perfectly or they're dead. There's no in-between failure mode, and they're a common point where a private seller genuinely doesn't know one channel has gone silent up top because the loss is subtle unless you're listening for it specifically. Number 4. Cerwin-Vega. Number 4 doesn't get the reverence the Japanese and East Coast names get, and that's exactly why I wanted it on this list. Cerwin-Vega was founded in 1954 by a man named Gene Trzynski, who came out of the aerospace world before he ever built a speaker. In 1957, his company built what's credited as the first solid-state audio amplifier, rated at 125 watts, a serious power figure for the era, and it came directly out of sonar amplifier work Jasinski had done for defense contracts. This is a company built by an engineer obsessed with output, not furniture. That obsession is what put them in the movies. In 1974, Universal released a disaster film called Earthquake, and it debuted with a new theater sound process called sensor surround. Cerwin-Vega engineered the hardware behind it. Dual 18-inch woofers folded into what they called E-bass horns, with a 6-foot internal horn path and a cutoff around 33 hertz, hitting a sensitivity rating of 106 decibels at 1 watt. Theaters actually shook. At Mann's Chinese Theater in Hollywood, they installed netting under the ceiling because plaster was coming down during screenings. Sensor Surround went on to earn a Scientific and Technical Academy Award. That's a real Oscar, sitting on the wall of a company that also made Your Neighbor's Party speakers. Those same folded horn principles trickled straight into Cerwin-Vega's home and pro lineup through the rest of the decade. This is not a refined sit down and analyze the recording speaker family. It's a high-efficiency, high-output design built by a guy who wanted bass you could feel in your chest. And by the late 70s, Cerwin-Vega had become the brand people bought specifically because it got loud without falling apart. On the bench, that reputation cuts both ways. These speakers lived hard lives. A lot of them spent their working years at high volume in garages, basements, and actual band's PA setups before they ever landed in someone's living room. So when you're shopping used, the two things I check first are the voice coils and the surrounds. A voice coil that's been driven into distortion repeatedly will develop a rub. You'll hear it as a scratchy, buzzing sound at certain frequencies, and it means the coil has walked off center in the gap. That's not a 5-minute fix. Have the seller power them up and play something with real bass at a real volume before you buy, not just a quiet tone test. Quiet tells you nothing about a speaker built for the opposite of quiet. Price to performance, these are some of the better bargains in the hobby, specifically because the brand doesn't carry the collector premium that Pioneer or JBL does. Just go in knowing what you're buying, a workhorse, not a china cabinet. The other component I always pull the back panel off to look at is the crossover network itself. On a lot of high-power Cerwin-Vega designs, the crossover is carrying serious current through air core inductors and resistors rated for real wattage. And those parts get stressed hard over a lifetime of being run near their limits. Look for scorching around the resistors, a resistor that's visibly changed color, or a burnt smell when you first power the pair up. None of that is unusual on a speaker built to be played loud and then actually played loud for 40 years. It's just something that a $150 asking price doesn't always disclose. Number 3. Altec Lansing Voice of the Theater A7. Try picturing this going up a narrow apartment stairwell, because that's the reality of living with number 3. The Altec Lansing A7, part of the Voice of the Theater line, wasn't designed as a home speaker at all. The lineage goes back to 1945, developed originally from movie theater installations, and for decades, this was the actual sound system playing in American cinemas, including famously at Capitol Records and various Hollywood scoring stages. It stuck around through the 70s because people who heard one in a theater eventually wanted one at home, and nothing sold at retail could touch that kind of scale. The design is a horn-loaded two-way, a 15-inch woofer loaded into a folded bass horn built into the cabinet itself, paired with a compression driver, commonly the 802 or 805 depending on the era, mounted on a sectoral horn up top. That's it. 2 ways, and it's extraordinarily efficient, typically rated well over 100 decibels sensitivity. That efficiency is the whole trick. Because the cabinet does so much of the acoustic work, you can drive an A7 with a genuinely small amplifier, even a few watts of clean tube power, and get output that feels effortless and uncompressed in a way a typical bookshelf speaker never will. The catch is the room. These cabinets are enormous, and I'm not exaggerating when I say they can visually take over a normal living room. If your space is small, you'll never sit far enough back to let the horn's dispersion pattern integrate properly, and it'll just feel like it's yelling at you from across the room.
Tonally, they're strongly mid-range forward, which is why they were built for dialogue and orchestral scoring in the first place. Great for movies, voices, and live recordings. Some modern music genres will feel a little clinical or forward through them. That's a character trade-off, not a defect. On the repair side, the parts ecosystem for Altec is genuinely deep. Woofers, compression drivers, horns, crossover components are all still available, and there's a long-running community that's kept this line alive for 50-plus years, so you're rarely stranded if something fails. What I check first on a used pair is the compression driver diaphragm. These are thin, phenolic or aluminum diaphragms sitting in a magnetic gap, and after decades they can develop cracks, or the adhesive holding the diaphragm to the voice coil former can let go. If a driver sounds thin, harsh, or distorted specifically in the upper mids, that's usually your diaphragm, not the amplifier. One thing most buyers get wrong is the amplifier pairing. Because the A7 is so efficient, people assume any tiny amp will do. And while a small tube amp can sound wonderful on the horn and compression driver, that 15-inch woofer still wants an amplifier with real damping factor and control behind it. Go too small on power and control, and the low end goes soft and undefined, even though everything above it sounds great. The sweet spot is a clean amp that respects how sensitive the speaker actually is, not just the smallest amp you own. Number 2. The Klipschorn. Walk into a hi-fi shop in 1978 and ask for the most efficient home speaker they carry, and this is what they'd bring out. The Klipschorn goes back to 1946, designed by Paul W. Klipsch, and it's the longest continuously produced loudspeaker in history. You can still order a new pair today, hand-built in the same factory in Hope, Arkansas, that's been building them for close to 80 years. A current pair runs right around $18,000. That is not a typo. And vintage 1970s pairs on the used market, which share the same fundamental horn geometry, sell for a fraction of that, commonly somewhere between $4,000 and $9,000 depending on condition, cosmetics, and whether the crossover has been serviced. What makes it a monster is the engineering, not the size. It's a fully horn-loaded, corner-placed design, a folded 15-inch bass horn built into a cabinet that's designed to use the two walls and the floor of your room as an extension of the horn path itself. Your room's corner literally becomes part of the speaker. The result is one of the most efficient designs ever put into production, meaning it can be driven beautifully by a genuinely small amplifier, sometimes single digits of watts, and still fill a room. Each cabinet weighs around 160 pounds and is built from over 100 individual wood panels, hand-assembled, and that construction method hasn't fundamentally changed since the original design. Here's the requirement nobody selling you a pair wants to lead with. It only performs correctly jammed into a genuine 90-degree corner with two solid walls. Without that corner, you are not getting the actual bass response this design was engineered around, full stop. No amount of wishful placement fixes that. On the bench, the thing most buyers never think to check is airtightness. This is a folded horn, meaning sound is traveling through a long internal path made of glued and sealed wood panel joints. After 50 years, those seams and the horn throat seals can loosen or dry out, and a leaking horn bleeds off low-end output before you ever suspect a driver problem. If a pair sounds thinner in the bass than the reputation suggests, don't assume the woofer's bad. Check the cabinet seams and horn throat seals first. It's a cheap, overlooked fix that gets ignored constantly. Sonically, the bass on a Klipschorn is enormous and effortless, but it's not the tightest or most modern-sounding low end you'll hear. The cabinet itself resonates as part of the sound, and that's simply the character of a horn-loaded corner design. Some people love that. Some people find it a little loose compared to a sealed or ported box. Neither reaction is wrong. It's a genuinely different way of making bass than almost anything built today. Before we get to the top spot, I want to mention one that technically breaks my own rules for this list, because leaving it off entirely would be dishonest. The Yamaha NS-1000 came out in 1974, and it's not a floor-dominating monster. It's a sealed, three-way studio monitor weighing around 66 pounds. What earns it a mention is the engineering. Yamaha used actual beryllium for the mid-range and tweeter dome diaphragms, a material that was borderline exotic even by aerospace standards at the time, and it remains genuinely difficult and expensive to work with today. That's why the NS-1000 ended up in real recording and broadcast facilities worldwide. It was trusted as a reference, not just sold as a showpiece. One honest, practical warning here, and this isn't hype, it's a documented material fact. Beryllium dust is hazardous if a dome is ever cracked or shattered and disturbed. If you're inspecting a used pair, make sure both domes are fully intact before you buy, and if one is damaged, don't start poking at it or trying to clean it yourself. That's a job for someone who knows how to handle the material safely. Otherwise, on the bench, these are honestly well-behaved speakers. The crossover networks are the usual suspect for value drift after 5 decades, and it's worth having a tech check the capacitors if the tonal balance seems off from what the reputation suggests. It's not a monster in the way the rest of this list is, but if pure engineering ambition is your measuring stick instead of sheer size, it belongs in the conversation. Number 1. JBL Paragon. Forget refrigerators. This one is nearly 9 feet wide, and you don't really place it in a room, you build the room around it. The JBL Paragon, officially the D44000, launched in 1957 and stayed in production all the way to 1983, the longest production run of any JBL product, and it reigned as the flagship straight through the 70s. It isn't 2 speakers, it's a complete stereo system, left and right channels built into a single curved, hand-finished wood cabinet that looks more like a piece of mid-century furniture than anything you'd call a loudspeaker. The concept came from a stereo sound pioneer named Richard Ranger, who theorized that sound could be reflected off a curved surface to solve a real problem with early stereo, the fact that the stereo image only worked correctly from one narrow sweet spot in the room. Sit off-center and the illusion collapsed. Ranger's original prototype was, by most accounts, an ungainly proof of concept. JBL brought in industrial designer Arnold Wolf to turn that concept into something people would actually want in their living room, and after what's documented as a genuinely difficult, tense collaboration between the 2 men, the Paragon was the result. A large curved center panel that spreads the stereo image wide enough for more than one person to actually hear it correctly. It wasn't just showing off, it was solving an actual acoustic problem, and it did it while looking like nothing else on the market. Each channel is a horn-loaded 3-way system, so underneath that furniture-grade cabinet, it's genuinely efficient, serious JBL horn hardware. At launch, it was the most expensive domestic loudspeaker sold in the United States. Original pricing was around $1,830, which works out to somewhere in the neighborhood of $20,000 in today's money for the pair. And each cabinet required over 100 man-hours of hand finishing. Across its entire 26-year production run, JBL only built around 1,000 of them. That combination, extreme cost, extreme scarcity, and a design that still turns heads 50 years later, is exactly why the used market for these is not a normal buying experience. Good original Paragons regularly sell well into 5 figures. The real risk isn't a repair bill, it's buying a cabinet with a finish that's been redone to hide water damage, cracked panels, or non-original drivers swapped in without disclosure. If you're ever seriously shopping for one of these, you look at it in person, ideally with someone who genuinely knows JBL's horn drivers and can verify the internals before any money hands change. On the electronic side, the usual age issues apply. The crossover capacitors in a speaker this old have almost certainly drifted from their original values after 5 decades, which shifts the tonal balance even on an otherwise pristine unit. So a proper recap by someone who knows the original network is worth factoring into the price if it hasn't already been done. For the overwhelming majority of people, this is a bucket list speaker, not a shopping list item. But standing in front of one is genuinely a different experience than looking at a photo of it, and there's nothing else from this era, or really any era, quite like it. That's the list. 5 genuine monsters, plus one that earned its way in on engineering alone. I know some of you are already disagreeing with the order, and that's fine. 50-year-old speakers all have different service histories, different miles on the voice coils, different hands that have worked on them, and sound is genuinely subjective on top of all that. Nobody who tells you there's one correct answer here has actually spent much time on the bench with this stuff. If you're out there shopping for any of these, I'll leave you with the one habit that saves people more money than anything else I could tell you. Don't buy from a photo and don't buy from a quiet room. Ask the seller to power the pair up and play something with real dynamic range and real bass at a volume that would actually reveal a rubbing coil or a torn surround. A speaker that's been sitting quiet in a closet for 20 years can look flawless and still fail the moment you finally push it. I'll leave you with something to think about instead of a big sign-off. These speakers were built by people who genuinely believed they'd still be playing music 50 years later. And for the most part, they were right. The question worth sitting with is whether anything being built today is made with that same assumption. I'll be back on the bench next time. Thanks for spending some time with me.